All right, now into part two uh, of Alistair MacIntyre's article, Is Patriotism a Virtue? And now this is going to be a fairly lengthy presentation, and I'm going to just apologize right now that I'm actually not going to be able to say everything that needs to be said about this. We're going into some deep moral theory, I guess you could say. We're getting kind of to the core of two different conflicting but deeply entrenched moral theories. And I'm just in this presentation, we're just going to skim the surface of it. So let's just get into it. So recall from the last presentation that there are basically two different views you can have on the question of whether or not patriotism is a virtue. Either it is or it isn't. And he thinks two different accounts of morality support two different answers. So one view will say that, so one type of morality, one certain view of morality will say that it is not a virtue, and then another view of morality, another type of moral theory, I guess, will say that patriotism is a virtue. So he's actually going to explain what theories support what answer. So the answer, the type of moral theory that would say that patriotism is not a virtue is what MacIntyre calls a liberal moral theory. So I'm going to just go ahead and say right now, liberal does not mean Democrat. It's unfortunate that he uses this term, or it's more like, I'd say, Enlightenment morality, modern moral theories, I guess you could say, as opposed to liberal. So I'll just say right now, he doesn't mean Democrat. He doesn't mean someone that's to the left of center, politically speaking. Instead, it comes from liberalism, classical liberalism, moral theories that come from Kant, John Stuart Mill, Rawls. There can be conservatives on our American political spectrum that have liberal moral views insofar as they have liberal moral theories. In fact, a lot of neoconservatives who say we can use whatever it takes to support American interests, influenced by, say, Henry Kissinger, for example, and his realpolitik. Their moral views are better explained by what MacIntyre is going to call it as a liberal moral theory. So again, liberal does not mean Democrat or left of center politically speaking when he says this. So how about I just explain what a liberal moral theory is? Well, three examples of a liberal moral theory would be deontology. That's basically duty, ology, the study of duties, which is a non-consequentialist theory. Basically, we looked at deontology in our presentation on non-consequentialism. Consequentialist moral theories and utilitarian moral theories, and then contractarian, which Rawls would fall under. So, again, just to stress the point that liberal does not mean Democrat, those who justify the use of torture at, say, Guantanamo Bay, we would probably not call liberals in our contemporary political discourse. We'd probably say that they're like conservatives or right-wingers. But generally, those quote-unquote right-wingers who justify torture, for example, to save lives, use utilitarian moral reasoning. So by MacIntyre's lights, they're using liberal political theories. Okay, so that's three examples. And I guess the presupposition, what is assumed by all these moral theories that would hold that patriotism is not a virtue, is that to judge from the moral standpoint is to judge impersonally or impartially. So remember when we talked about Rawls, and I showed you this picture of justice, and justice has a blindfold. Justice is blind, right? Well, that's kind of where this impartiality is coming from. To judge means you're not going to be partial. You're not going to judge in favor of one thing over another just because you're partial to it. You're not going to judge that torture is wrong just because it happens to be torturing people you're related to. You judge torture is wrong because it's just wrong. So there's no partiality in your standpoint. It's impersonal as well. And we want, a judge to judge that way. We don't want a judge to decide in favor of a plaintiff that the judge has a personal connection to. So this is a presupposition of liberal moral theories. I'm quoting MacIntyre, but I don't have any quotation marks. It is to judge as any rational person would judge, independently of his or her interests, affections, and social position. So to act morally according to these liberal moral theories is to act in accordance with these impersonal judgments. So remember Rawls again, and I think Rawls was his target. Well, Rawls is a target, but Rawls, just since we've just studied him, comes out so vividly here. Remember Rawls's veil of ignorance in the original position, where you don't know anything about who you are. You abstract yourself away from all your interests, your attachments, your relations, your talents, your skills, and you're an abstract kind of just solely rational, moral human being. That's it. That's kind of and then basically the principles that you would decide on in this behind this veil of ignorance in this original position would be the principle. I mean, you decide them basically based on impersonal and impartial moral judgments, because you would have abstracted yourself away from any attachments that would affect how you judge. So yeah, that's just so Rawls is kind of like the culmination, I guess, of these liberal theories. So then the conflict, according to MacIntyre, with patriotism will be obvious. Patriotism requires me to exhibit peculiar devotion to my nation and not yours. So basically, patriotism requires that I don't act impersonally. So this notion of we are the world, patriotism seems to run afoul of that. You should, if you live there, you should care more about people there than people there, for example. Okay, so there's a rejoinder. You could have a liberal patriotism. So maybe liberal moral theories aren't committed to patriotism being a vice. You could have a liberal patriotism which holds a proper devotion to one's own nation that is not allowed to violate the constraints set by the impersonal moral standpoint. So you could have a devotion to your nation as long as it doesn't run afoul of these kind of universal moral constraints that were arrived at through this impartial and moral standpoint. Okay, that seems maybe plausible. Well, MacIntyre has a response. Actually, his response is two situations. Hold on, let me take a sip of my coffee. Sorry, yeah. Just all this lecturing, man, really dries my throat and also saps me of energy, so that's what coffee's for. Solves my thirst problem and my lack of energy problem. Okay, I just realized that the audio and video aren't completely synced. That looked weird. I just reviewed that clip of me drinking coffee. Oh well, I'm working with limited technology. So the first situation involves scarcity of essential resources, which is a situation that happens all the time. So when this situation arises, the impersonal moral standpoint demands that each individual person, regardless of their nationality, counts for no more than one. Okay? So you've got a limited amount of water. Who do you give it to? Well, according to the liberal moral standpoint, every person counts for just one. While the patriotic standpoint demands that one do what they can to further the interests of their community at the expense of others. So they conflict. They both can't be true. So basically, if you're a patriot and you have a limited amount of water, you should give that water to like your fellow citizens. That's who you should be partial to. Whereas if you hold to a liberal moral theory, where every person counts for one, then you shouldn't prioritize your fellow citizens in how you distribute water. So basically, both. So that's the first response to why you can't really be a liberal patriot. Second, there are differences between communities about the right way for each to live. There are incompatibilities between beliefs that lead to situations in which the moral standpoint and the patriotic standpoint are at odds. So, for example, the moral standpoint requires neutrality, not only between competing interests, but also competing beliefs, such as religious views, whereas patriotism requires one to be partisan to the beliefs of their nation. Yeah, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. All right. So then we'll summarize. Let's look at MacIntyre's summarization of the liberal position of liberal patriotism. Morality is constituted by rules to which any rational person would, under certain ideal conditions, give assent. For example, recall Rawls's veil of ignorance in the original position. What would people behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, abstracted from all their interests, what moral principles would they assent to? 2, those rules impose constraints upon and are neutral between rival and competing interests. So, for example, the moral principles you decide on in the original position is neutral between the interests of farmers and the interests of, say, factory owners. And 3, these rules are neutral between rival and competing sets of beliefs about what is the best way for human beings to live. So, for example, a Christian has a different answer for the best way for a human to live than perhaps, say, a Buddhist, even though there might be some overlaps. The rules of liberal morality are going to be neutral between that. It's one thing Rawls was aiming for. Okay, for the units that provide the subject matter of morality, as well as its agents, are individual human beings, and that in moral evaluations, each individual is to count for one and nobody for more than one. And remember, this is on contrast to, I guess, the patriotic viewpoint, or the morality assumed by a view of patriotism as a virtue, where you should give kind of preference and priority to your fellow citizens. If you have a limited amount of water, you should give it to your fellow Americans instead of Ethiopians, for example. And 5, the standpoint of the moral agent, constituted by allegiance to these rules, is one and the same for all moral agents, and as such is independent of social particularity. Of all social particularity. Basically, the rules apply to everyone, no matter where and when you're born. All right. Well, there's an alternative morality, and this is the type of morality, according to MacIntyre, that would support the thesis that patriotism is a virtue. So let's just explore what this morality is. So, according to MacIntyre, where and from whom I learn my morality is crucial not only for the content of my moral beliefs, but the nature of my moral commitment. So that what I learn as a guide to my actions and as a standard for evaluating them is never morality as such, but always the highly specific morality of some highly specific social order. So you don't just learn this abstract liberal, Rawlsian political or utilitarian morality. You learn what it is to be a good Baptist in Indiana, or what it is to be a good Muslim in Tunisia, or what it is to be a good Frenchman in France, or what it is to be a good Strasbourgian in Strasbourg, France. It's particular. What it is to be a good member of this family. There's a challenge then. Someone could respond, well, that's how you learn morality. But the morality you learn is just an application of these more universal rules that you get from, say, Rawls or utilitarianism. One becomes a real, genuine moral agent when you free yourself from those particularities and you take on that impersonal standpoint. So again, Rawls, and then for those of you in psychology, you may have heard of Kohlberg and his notion of moral development. And really, a fully mature, developed moral human being, I believe, is a deontologist, according to Kohlberg. You're thinking like a good Kantian. Whereas, kids are just rule followers. That's been challenged, by the way, but we'll look at that another time. It's been empirically challenged. There's contemporary work in psychology, social psychology, that challenges a lot of Kohlberg's views. But this is not a psychology class. So, anyways, that's a challenge. Just like math. Math deals with these universal things, even though some people learn with an abacus and others learn with a calculator. Well, it's the same with morality. All right, MacIntyre has a response to that challenge. He says, the goods by reference to which, and for the sake of which, any set of rules must be justified are also socially specific and particular goods. So we're not working for these abstract Rawlsian utilitarian goods, we're working for these particular goods. The type of goods that a person in Indiana would care about, or a person in Lafayette. Although Lafayette is not the best example since we're a university town, we have people from all over the world. But Kokomo, Indiana, probably a lot more particularized, a lot less global and international and diverse. Like that. We're working for these specific goods. What is to be a good member of this family, this farm community, this ethnic enclave in New York City? And there's some truth to that. I'm not reaching this abstract universal norm of goodness. I want to be a good philosophy instructor at Purdue University. That's my goal. Okay. So, according to MacIntyre, goods are never encountered except as particularized. And that's true as well, and the same applies to bads. You never encounter these abstract, universal, general goods. You encounter particular goods. All right? Doing well on a test is a particular good. Having a good vacation with your family is a particular good.
So, Lone Star, now you see that evil will always triumph, because good is dumb. Lone Star. Too bad this isn't the wide world of sports.
By the way, Dark Helmet was not talking about particular goods. He's talking about this notion of being the abstract, general, universal good. He's talking about liberal moral theories. So he agrees with MacIntyre. All right. So thus it follows, according to MacIntyre, that I find my justification for allegiance to these rules of morality in my particular community. Deprived of that community, I would have no reason to be moral. So imagine this scenario. You're going to spend the rest of your life on a desert island by yourself, alone. Your boyfriend or girlfriend won't be there. You won't have Skype or Facebook, no internet. Just you and a bunch of coconuts and bananas. So here's my question. What motivation, what reasons would you have to be moral? Can you think of any? My hunch is you probably can't. Okay, so then here's his argument then for how patriotism, the moral theory that would assume that patriotism is a virtue. If, it's conditional, if one can only apprehend the version of the rules of morality that are incarnated in a specific community, and two, the justification of morality must be in terms of particular goods enjoyed within the life of particular communities. Three, we are brought into being and maintained as moral agents only through the particular kinds of moral sustenance provided by one's community. Then, deprived of this community, you're likely to flourish as a moral agent. So, your allegiance to their community and what it requires of one, even to the point of it requiring you to die, could not meaningfully be contrasted with or counterposed to what morality requires of one. So, detached from the community, one loses one's hold on all genuine standards of judgment. So, loyalty to that community is a prerequisite for morality. So these PowerPoint slides are on Blackboard. So it's a long argument, but I'm not going to spend any more time on it. If you want to, I think if you just spend enough time yourself just reading through it carefully, you should get at what he's getting at. All right. So there's a problem. Liberal morality requires one to assume an abstract. So let's look at, actually real quick, MacIntyre, or as I recall in the first presentation on the task of a moral philosopher, he's not going to settle between the view of morality that says patriotism is a virtue and the view of morality that says it's a vice. He's not going to settle that in this article, okay? So instead what we're going to do then is just kind of bring up the problems that both views have, both moralities have, which MacIntyre acknowledges. He brings them up. We're just going to look at what he says the problems are. I think there are other philosophers out there that have argued extensively to settle one or the other view, and we're going to read some of them this week. But at this point, we're just kind of look at the weaknesses of both types of moral theories. They also have strengths. In fact, the weaknesses of one will be the strength of another in a sense. So, first we'll start with problems with liberal moral theories. Problem. Liberal morality requires one to assume an abstract and artificial stance, that of a rational being as such, responding to the requirements of morality not as a parent or teacher or student, but instead as a boring rational agent who has abstracted himself from all social particulars, like, what Rawls wants you to do, behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. Problem. How could you justify that? That is, if you abstract all my interests away from me, what do you have left? I'm not a stick figure, damn it. I'm Davis Kirkendall. So that's a pretty serious objection. It's just, when we abstract all this stuff away from human beings, what are we talking about anymore? Okay? Well, the Patriot has an answer to that, and that is what rocks dream of. Nothing. So, but the liberal does have a response. The Patriot hasn't won yet. They could respond, well, such abstraction and detachment is defensible because, well, honestly, it's necessary for moral freedom. For unless I can stand back from every and any feature of that status quo, including the roles within it which I myself presently inhabit, I will be unable to view it critically and decide for myself what stance it is rational and right for me to adopt. So basically, if you can't do that, then you can't rationally reflect on your various commitments. But that's what it is to be rational, is to be able to reflect and kind of critically assess stuff. So, And so the liberal's going to say, if you want to consider yourself as an actual rational being, then you have to be able to abstract yourself from all those commitments and attachments. Okay. Okay, so what are some problems with patriotism, and, or the view of morality that supports patriotism? Well, one, liberal morality, as we just saw, allows no limitations on criticisms of the social status quo. No institution, practice, loyalty, etc. is immune from questioning. However, with patriotism, as it is framed in terms of membership in a particular social community, you have to have at least some fundamental structures that are exempt from criticism. And to that extent, then rational criticism is just going to be ruled out by patriotism. So to that extent, the morality that supports patriotism is quote-unquote in opposition with reason or rationality. But that just means that patriotism can only be a virtue in a morality that condones irrational commitments. Again, who would want to be a member of that morality? Well, the Patriot has some responses. MacIntyre noted several, and I'm going to draw attention to a few right here. First, there is a sense in which the liberal is correct in that something will be exempted from criticism. But what's important is what's exempted. So it's not everything is exempt from criticism, it's something particular. It's not the status quo of power in government and government policies. So MacIntyre is perfectly fine with you criticizing the government, for example, or their policies, or the misuse of power. Instead, what's exempted is the nation as conceived as a project brought to birth in the past and carried on so that a morally distinctive community was brought into being that embodied a claim to political autonomy. So the Patriots' allegiance is to this distinctive, historically grounded moral and political identity. This is consistent with rejecting current forms of government. So the cause of France, even if you don't like the current French government, you're not in a position to criticize, the nation as a project, the French nation, for example, even though you can be critical of the current government. It's a bit more palatable. Second response, according to MacIntyre, this is a tu quoque. Liberal morality, with its commitment to impartiality and its impersonality, is also morally dangerous. So you think it's morally dangerous to exclude some things from rational criticism? Well, there is another danger with the opposite moral view. Let's take a look at that. Suppose the bonds of patriotism dissolved. MacIntyre asks, could liberal moral philosophy substitute something in its place? And MacIntyre is going to say, probably not. So here's a lengthy quote, but it's actually, I don't really need to explain it much. It's pretty self-explanatory. So he writes, of the members of the armed forces, some of you might be members of that, or have family members or friends that are, it must require both that they be prepared to sacrifice their own lives, it's true, for the sake of the community's security, true, and that their willingness to do so be not contingent upon their own individual evaluation of the rightness or wrongness of their country's cause on some specific issue, measured by some standard that is neutral and impartial relative to the interests of their own community and the interests of other communities. So basically, if you're a soldier, you have to be prepared to die for the cause of your country. And you kind of have to be prepared to obey orders regardless. And that is to say, good soldiers may not be liberals, and must indeed embody in their actions a good deal at least of the morality of patriotism. So the political survival of any polity in which liberal morality had secured large-scale allegiance would depend on there being still enough young men and women who rejected that liberal morality. And in this sense, liberal morality tends toward the dissolution of social bonds. So basically saying, any country that's going to survive needs to have a subset of its members that do not subscribe to a liberal morality, and those would be the ones that serve in the military, that would be prepared to die for their country, and in self-defense of their country, for the rest of the people in that country. And he's saying those people cannot subscribe to the liberal morality. So basically saying liberal morality couldn't guarantee the survival of a nation. That seems to be a problem for liberal morality, I'd say. So, concluding thoughts, and like I said, this doesn't resolve the debate, it just clarifies what is actually at issue. So both liberals and patriots are right in a sense. According to MacIntyre, liberals are right in that patriotism is dangerous insofar as it places some of our ties beyond rational scrutiny, but patriots are right in that liberal morality renders our social and moral ties open to dissolution by rational criticism.